Carl Jung, the architect who mapped the treacherous landscape of the human subconscious, encountered a phenomenon so disruptive, so terrifyingly free, it made him question the very foundation of psychology itself. He studied a man who was, quite literally, immune to emotional violence. You could betray this man, insult him, destroy his reputation, or ruin his life. Zero emotional reaction. Not because he suppressed his anger, but because the biological mechanism that generates it, the high-speed survival reflex we call being triggered, had fundamentally broken down. It could not work. His name was Heinrich. When his business partner stole everything, wiping out 20 years of work, Jung asked him how he felt about the betrayer. Heinrich's answer haunted Jung: "Why would I be angry at a mirror?" This is the psychological pivot that grants complete freedom, and it begins with accepting one brutal truth. Every single person who makes your blood boil, the colleague, the politician, the relative, is showing you a precise, inescapable reflection of the shadow traits you hate, fear, and have buried deepest within yourself. The arrogance, the laziness, the crippling insecurity, that thing they do that sends you into a rage. It is in you. The reason you hate it so violently in them is because you are biologically terrified of seeing it in yourself. And here is the cost of that denial: your anger is not a moral statement. It is a continuous, toxic release of cortisol, a chemical self-poisoning that ensures you waste every ounce of biological energy fighting external enemies that are, in fact, just projections of your own internal war. That hatred, that visceral surge of adrenaline when someone pushes your buttons, is not a choice you make. It is a primitive neurobiological safety mechanism. When they exhibit the trait you despise, your brain's limbic system, specifically the amygdala, registers it as a threat. It's an immediate, high-speed danger assessment. This is the thing I have repressed. And if it is outside, it might expose the vulnerability inside. Your frontal cortex, the seat of reason and logic, is bypassed entirely. This is the amygdala hijack. The unconscious mind has already initiated the fight or flight response before you have time to consciously identify the color of their shirt. It floods your system with cortisol, the hormone of chronic stress. Anger is simply the label we put on a cascade of self-poisoning chemicals designed for survival in the prehistoric savanna, where danger was physical and immediate. This chemical warfare, when sustained over days and weeks of chronic outrage, doesn't just ruin your mood, it physically degrades you. It scars the hippocampus, disrupting memory and sleep. It weakens the immune system. Maria, the teacher we mentioned, didn't have panic attacks because her colleague was mean. She had them because she was living in a perpetual state of chemical self-immolation, fueled by her absolute refusal to accept her own shadow. Heinrich, however, was a glitch in the system. When his business partner betrayed him, his amygdala performed the threat assessment. But when Heinrich consciously labeled the attacker as a mirror, the system broke down. The brain could not compute: how can the external threat be identical to the internal self-image I already accept? The mechanism stalls. The automatic circuit trigger leads to anger is instantly short-circuited. The anger factory shuts down. Not through willpower, not through management, but through neurobiological incompatibility. He saw the words, the insults, the attacks, not as personal offenses, but as data points floating in the Heinrich gap, that crucial space between stimulus and response. That gap is where freedom resides. But you must pay for that gap with a painful realization. For Maria, this realization meant confronting 3 years of self-deception. Her hated colleague, the one who stole ideas and spread rumors, was the external proxy for Maria's own deep-seated professional fraudulence. She had spent 1,000 hours analyzing the flaws of her attacker, providing her default mode network DMN, the brain's constant self-narrative machine, with ample justification for her rage. The rage, the sleepless nights, The panic, these weren't caused by the colleague. They were caused by Maria's internal DMN, using the external figure as a necessary shield. The moment she heard her own complaints, she is insecure. She tears others down. She steals ideas and realized she was describing herself. The shield evaporated. This recognition felt like dying because the ego's construction of the victim status was being violently dismantled. 3 years of righteous moral superiority vanished. But when the anger factory shut down, something else took its place, an unnerving, absolute silence. When the colleague returned the next day, Maria saw not an enemy, but a vessel of pain. Maria watched her, observing the aggression not as malice, but as pain expressing itself as aggression. Fear expressing itself as attack. The automatic response mechanism had failed, leaving only observation. The silence she found was a power beyond anger. But this power comes with a terrifying consequence, one that C.G. Jung himself found deeply disturbing. Jung called this state, the inability to be triggered, the most dangerous psychological achievement. Not dangerous to the individual, but dangerous to the collective. Because once you step outside the emotional game, you notice the unthinkable truth: everyone around you, participating in the normal cycle of outrage, blame, and projection, is fundamentally insane. They are fighting shadows that do not exist. They are spending their finite mental and biological energy battling external mirrors of their own unacknowledged self-hatred. You watch your friend destroy their career because their boss reminds them of a parent, or ruin a relationship because their partner echoes an old insecurity. They believe they are fighting the husband, the wife, the boss. They are, in fact, fighting ghosts. You become the only sober person, a deeply intoxicated party. You see the code. You see the matrix of emotional imprisonment. The crowd is stumbling, laughing too loud, fighting over trivialities, driven by ancient, unacknowledged wounds. And you, standing completely clear, are terrifying to them. This leads to the crushing loneliness Heinrich described. Why the loneliness? Because the shared anger, the mutual offense, the collective outrage, this is the social emotional contract that binds the tribe. For millennia, group cohesion relied on defining us by aggressively hating them. We bond over shared grievances. We validate our identity by what we are against. This is evolutionary psychology in action. In ancestral environments, the utility of outrage was high. Pointing fingers at a tribal member, "He's selfish, he's lazy," was a quick, effective tool for boundary setting and enforcing morality. We use projection as a social lubricant. When you withdraw your willingness to participate in the us versus them mechanism, you forfeit the primary evolutionary benefit of belonging. We are running tribal software, developed for groups of 150, on a global network of 8 billion people. This evolutionary mismatch is the engine of modern chaos, and it is ruthlessly exploited. We have entered the era of the digital projection farm. Social media platforms are not communication tools. They are digital Skinner boxes designed to maximize conflict. The algorithm is structurally dependent on your amygdala hijack. It quickly learns what image, what comment, what ideological opponent triggers your shadow, and it feeds that mirror directly to your feed, 24 hours a day. Why? Because the response is dopamine. Every time you angrily type a critique or share a piece of divisive content, you get a rush of moral superiority dopamine. You are reaffirming your identity not through positive creation, but through negative opposition. I am good because I hate X. I am smart because I oppose Y. In a fragmented world, this sense of moral righteousness is the most valuable social currency. And this mechanism relies entirely on your willingness to perpetually define yourself as a victim. The most agonizing psychological cost of radical self-responsibility is this: to achieve true freedom, you must permanently abandon the comfort of victimhood. Victimhood provides social attention, excuses for lack of achievement, and the powerful bond of shared oppression. Society rewards the perpetually offended. When you become untriggerable, when you realize that being offended is always a choice, not something that happens to you, you forfeit that shield. You take total, terrifying responsibility for your internal state, and you lose the right to complain. Forever. This is why the untriggerable person, the one who has processed their own shadow, becomes a strategic weapon in the modern world. In the industrial age, power was measured in physical resources. In the attention economy, power is measured in internal sovereignty control over your own psychological resources. Every moment you spend fighting an external mirror, every rush of cortisol, every hour spent in emotional plotting that is biological and strategic resource depletion. You are exhausting yourself in a battle that benefits only the systems designed to harvest your attention and leverage your insecurity. David lived inside this psychological slaughterhouse. His boss was a master manipulator, exploiting the fear and anxiety of everyone around him. Colleagues were having breakdowns, medicating their misery. David was actively dying panic attacks, physical sickness, until he had his moment of realization. David stopped seeing the monster and started seeing the code. The screaming wasn't strength. It was an expression of absolute terror. His boss was a scared, emotionally stunted child in an expensive suit, desperately trying to project an illusion of power because he was consumed by his own powerlessness and self-hatred. The attack was not directed at David. It was pain looking for a loud echo. Once David saw the terror, he could not be hurt. The trigger was inert. His boss would insult him, and David would respond not with defense or counterattack, but with genuine, non-sarcastic curiosity. He would ask clarifying questions, thank him for the feedback, and seek to understand the underlying organizational pain, not the personal insult. While the entire department was exhausted by forming alliances, plotting revenge, and nursing their emotional wounds, David remained totally focused. He spent 0% of his psychological energy on emotional drama. He had access to 100% of his cognitive resources, dedicating them purely to performance. This creates an invulnerable internal advantage. Within 6 months, David was running the department. His old tyrant of a boss ended up reporting to him. The power had shifted entirely because the ability to be manipulated is a vulnerability. The inability to be manipulated is the ultimate strategic resource. When the boss finally broke down and asked how David survived him, the answer was brutal in its simplicity. "I survived you," David explained, "because I realized you were not attacking me. You were attacking yourself, your own fear, your own shortcomings. I merely happened to be standing in the path of your self-destruction." These individuals, Heinrich, Maria, David had stepped completely outside the societal game of emotional leverage. Think about what our normal life is: an endless, mutually agreed upon cycle of emotional violence. Parents trigger guilt in children. Partners push buttons. Governments use fear. Companies use manufactured insecurity. Every system of control, from relationships to empires, depends entirely on the ability to exploit your internal shadow. But Jung's immune individuals became impenetrable. You could not make them afraid because they had seen through fear itself. You could not make them guilty because they understood guilt was a construct of the self, not an objective truth. You could not trigger their insecurity because they had accepted their whole self-shadow and all. They were immune to the entire modern apparatus of manipulation. The price was being seen as arrogant, cold, or inhuman by the very people they could no longer join in collective hysteria. But their calm exposed the hidden cost of everyone else's compliance. Their non-reaction proved that the emperor of outrage has no clothes. The great twist, the final layer Jung uncovered, was that this state of psychological invulnerability did not lead to cold detachment. It led to something far more powerful, something beyond the petty emotional drama of ordinary life. It led to conscious compassion. Hinrich explained it. I can't get angry at people anymore, because I see they are all just hurt children in adult bodies, fighting battles that ended decades ago against enemies who have been dead for years. How can you be angry at someone who is that lost? The fury dissolves into profound recognition. This conscious compassion, this lack of rage, is not passive acceptance. It is a profound, strategic insight. When Maria or David observed the aggressor, they were not just seeing a hurt child, they were witnessing a failure of the attacker's internal threat assessment system. To understand the mechanism, we must ground it in biology. Anger is not a philosophy, it is a biochemical reaction. When you are triggered, your amygdala, the brain's primitive threat detector, signals danger before your prefrontal cortex, the seat of conscious thought, can even process the insult. The mechanism broken by Hinrich was the amygdala hijack. For years, Maria's company worker was an external threat, causing a chronic flood of cortisol and adrenaline. Maria wasn't just mentally stressed, she was suffering from chronic biochemical poisoning. Her panic attacks were a symptom of this endless internal alarm system. But when she saw her aggressor as her own shadow, a reflection of her own fears, the amygdala short-circuited. It could not classify an internal projection as an external, lethal threat. No projection, no threat. No threat, no cascade of stress hormones. The factory that created suffering, as Hinrich said, went out of business because the chemical supply line was cut. Why is this mechanism so deeply entrenched? Because anger and projection were once evolutionarily adaptive. We are using ancient tribal software to run a modern, global society. In the ancestral environment, quick outrage and collective hatred against a deviating member were tools for maintaining social cohesion. Evolutionary psychology calls this the mismatch theory. Our brains are hardwired for communities of around 150 people, Dunbar's number. Outrage was necessary social cement. When we rapidly hate an outsider, the group affirms, we are not that. We confirm our boundaries and moral superiority. The person who refuses to participate in shared outrage, the Hinrich, Maria, or David, is actively rejecting this ancient tribal contract. This is the root of the loneliness Jung identified. You have traded the comfort of belonging, via shared hatred, for the terrifying clarity of the truth. You are telling the collective, through your sheer, unshakable calm, that their emotional reality is fabricated. You have abandoned the emotional leverage they rely on to define their world. You have become an existential threat to the collective insanity, simply by existing outside of its influence. The modern world hasn't just noticed this flaw in our evolutionary programming, it has weaponized it. They built machines designed explicitly to maximize your projection and harvest your rage. We are talking about the digital projection farms. Social media algorithms do not prioritize connection or consensus. They are optimized for engagement, and nothing generates more reliable, high-velocity engagement than moral outrage and tribal division. The algorithm wants you to find an external shadow to attack, because every attack is a data point, an ad impression, and a dopamine hit. This is the digital Skinner box. The psychological reward for criticizing someone online, for venting your hatred, is a rush of dopamine and a temporary feeling of moral superiority. The platform feeds you the content that explicitly targets the unresolved trauma and the hidden shadow you hate most in yourself. We are building our modern identity not on what we stand for, but on what we passionately oppose. Identity through opposition is the cheapest, easiest form of self-definition in a fragmented world. Your shadow becomes your social currency. Your enemies define your community. The cost is the permanent hypervigilance of your nervous system. You are trained, Pavlovian style, to seek out offense, because the offense is the prerequisite for the dopamine hit of righteous condemnation. This endless cycle of seeking triggers ensures the chronic cortisol drip never stops. David found his breakthrough by understanding that the opposite of victimhood is not indifference, but radical self-responsibility. The ultimate cost of achieving psychological freedom is relinquishing the single most seductive currency in modern society, the right to be a victim. Victim status grants you immediate social sympathy, justification for your failures, and exemption from personal work. It is a powerful, addictive shield. When Heinrich realized his business partner's betrayal was a mirror of his own internal greed, he lost the right to blame, and in doing so, gained everything. True freedom requires you to accept total ownership of your internal state. You must surrender your justification for anger, your excuse for suffering, and your right to be offended. If the external world cannot make you suffer, then who is responsible for your suffering? Only you. This is what terrified Jung, the realization that an individual who cannot be emotionally leveraged is a direct existential threat to every system of control. Jung saw that all power structures, political, commercial, relational, depend entirely on exploiting fear, guilt, and the need for shared outrage. In the industrial age, control was about physical coercion. In the attention economy, control is about psychological leverage. Power is not held by those who control resources, but by those who control your emotional attention and response. They need you angry. They need you to feel victimized. The ability to remain untriggered is the ultimate competitive advantage in the modern landscape. While your rivals are emotionally exhausting themselves in the digital projection farm, wasting their biological resources, cortisol, and mental energy on conflicts against their own shadows, you are operating at peak efficiency. David did not become a leader by playing the game of emotional warfare. He became a leader by refusing to play it at all. His focus, his clarity, and his immunity allowed him to utilize 100% of his cognitive resources on solving problems, not fighting phantoms. This is strategic, spiritual dominance. Conscious compassion is the proof that true power does not lie in hardness, but in profound clarity. It is the ability to look at your attacker, strip away the facade of their aggression, and see the raw, desperate pain beneath. When Maria heard a screaming parent, she didn't hear an insult. She heard, "I am terrified my child will fail, and it will reflect on me." When she saw a student acting out, she heard, "I am in pain, and I don't know how to express it." Pain expressing itself as aggression. Fear expressing itself as attack. This recognition is the final key. You are not fighting external evil. You are witnessing the universal drama of the human shadow. You are witnessing the pain of separation, playing itself out through misplaced rage. And you have the choice: join the drama, or provide the stillness required for healing. But the price remains absolute. You will be feared. You will be misunderstood. You will be hated by those who cannot bear the reflection of their own internal chaos in your calm demeanor. You cannot participate in their sleepwalking, and they cannot forgive you for being awake. The question Jung wrestled with is the same question posed to you now. Do you truly want to be free? Not free from external constraints, but free from the prison of your own emotional reactions. Free from the exhausting game of trigger and response, because this freedom costs everything you currently use to define yourself: your identity as a victim, your right to be offended, your justification for anger, and your comfort in shared blame. All of it must go. What remains is a state of being that is almost impossible to describe: a human being who cannot be controlled through emotional manipulation. Someone who sees the code, someone who has stepped out of the collective insanity and achieved invulnerable internal advantage. You now know this is possible. You can never unknow it. The ignorance that sustained your anger is gone forever. The choice has always been yours. But now, you cannot pretend you don't know there is a choice. You can keep fighting your mirrors, or you can put down the weapons and finally be free. let us return to the biological architecture of your captivity. The mechanism that Heinrich and Maria broke is primal, the amygdala hijack. For most of you, an insult is not a linguistic event, it is a neurological threat. Your amygdala, the evolutionary watchdog, detects the aggressive signal and floods your system with cortisol and adrenaline before your prefrontal cortex, the seat of reason, even registers the words. You are reacting, not choosing. Anger, in this context, is simply a fast-acting neurochemical poison designed for tribal conflict, not for modern problem-solving. It is a biological tax you pay. Every time you project your own shadow outward, this primal software is now being ruthlessly exploited. In the attention economy, the greatest profit margin is derived not from controlling resources, but from controlling your reaction. Social media algorithms are digital projection farms. They are engineered to bypass your logic and trigger your amygdala, delivering a burst of dopamine every time you confirm your moral superiority by attacking the external shadow. Your outrage is a commodity. It is the fuel for their system. When you choose anger, you are willingly becoming the product, paying a devastating biological cost in chronic stress, lost sleep, and systemic inflammation, just to maintain the illusion that the fight is out there. Jung knew this was the ultimate strategic power. When you become the untriggerable person, you achieve a state of invulnerable internal advantage. While everyone else is exhausting their energy in battles against phantoms, diverting their cognitive resources into managing cortisol spikes and plotting emotional revenge, you maintain absolute clarity. David didn't rise to power because he was politically skilled. He rose because he retained 100% of his focus. While the collective was drowning in the evolutionary need for shared outrage, the tribal bonding mechanism, he refused the bond. He chose the truth of his singularity over the comfort of belonging to the shared insanity. But this freedom comes with a crushing price, the price of sovereignty. To step out of the emotional matrix, you must accept the complete, final death of the victim identity. Modern society offers enormous social currency and comfort in being a victim. It provides a community of shared blame and an exemption from self-responsibility. When you take back the projection, when you declare, "My suffering is caused by my reaction, not their action," you forfeit that currency forever. You lose the right to complain. You lose the automatic sympathy of your tribe. You will be feared, hated, and isolated, because your calm reveals the terrifying truth of their own complicity in their suffering. This is why Jung used the term conscious compassion, a powerful term of strategic realism. It is not pity. Pity confirms separation. Conscious compassion is the recognition of shared reality. You see the aggressor not as an enemy, but as a traumatized architect of their own pain. You see the screaming boss, the critical spouse, the raging politician, and you understand that their aggression is simply the expression of deep internal fear and pain. Pain expressing itself as aggression, fear expressing itself as arrogance. Once you see the architectural blueprint of their suffering, you can no longer be angry. You can only observe. This realization transforms the battlefield. The moment you are untriggerable, you stop wasting your life fighting external mirrors, and you redirect all that biological and mental energy toward constructive, sovereign action. You stop building an identity based on what you oppose, and start building a life based on what you create. The path to complete psychological freedom is available. Heinrich found it. Maria found it. David found it. It is not a gift. It is a choice made through sacrifice. You now know the terrifying secret. You know that anger is a choice. You know that being offended is a neurological habit. You can never unknow the truth that other people's behavior is about their pain, not your worth. The mechanism of projection is exposed. The collective insanity is visible. The choice has always been yours, but now, You cannot pretend you don't know there is a choice. Do you remain in the exhausting, intoxicating game of mutual imprisonment, or do you pay the price, accept the isolation, and claim the absolute sovereignty of the untriggerable mind?